all know that straight up lecturing is not usually my style. The thing is, there are a number of ideas that I've been wrestling with over the last few months and years, and been trying out with students and other audiences, and having some give and take, some feedback, to try and see how these ideas hold together. And I wanted to take this time, now that we've gotten this class started, and try out some of these ideas on y'all. I want to see how far we get today, and see if there's, I hope, time for some questions and some discussion. And I want your honest feedback, like, how does all of this hold together? I do have some tentative plans for how to use some of these ideas in the future, and so it really will help me to hear from you. So if you want to take notes or just think of stuff, or see if you can follow along with the screen, and we'll just see how this goes. It's sort of wide open. You also probably know me well enough by now to know that if I have a certain amount of stuff that I want to get done in a period, then I better stick pretty close to what I wrote. Otherwise, we'll go off into too many directions, okay? So I'm going to try and just be, I don't like this thing. I don't want to do it. This seems kind of in the way. You ever see War of the Worlds? So weird. All right, friends. So now that we've started to become acquainted with the purpose and the shape of this course, we can say a few things about what it's about, right? The immediate purpose of the course is to train college students. Sorry, I don't know if I actually hit the button. I did. Yeah. So now that we've started to get acquainted with this course, we can say that the immediate purpose of it is to train college students in civic engagement at the state level, to help you understand how state government works and how citizens can influence, and why this is so important in the context of the federal system in the United States, where so much of the decision-making that affects people's lives takes place at the level of state government, not just at the level of the national government. And the chapter that we discussed last week gave us some indications as to why this is so critical right now in the context of the crisis of democracy and identity that we're facing as a country. So what I want to do with you this week is to take a step even further back, to think together about the bigger significance of what we're here to do. And this has everything to do with situating ourselves properly in time and space, and asking ourselves the best possible questions about who we are and the nature of our life together here in this small piece of the earth called South Carolina. And I want to take this week to share with you some of the ways that my approach to studying South Carolina's past has been changing in recent years, and to sketch out with you a framework for understanding our history that might help us and future generations to meet the challenging tasks ahead. So in the interest of full disclosure, I want to start with two propositions that animate this approach. I don't have time to defend them properly or explain them thoroughly, so all I'm going to do is just briefly lay them out. You do not have to agree with these two propositions, but I do want you to know what my starting points are that affect how I think about South Carolina, past, present, and future. And this does affect how I've chosen to organize this course, all right? So here are the two propositions. The first proposition is that humanity in all our diversity constitutes one species, one organic whole, and that we are all fundamentally equal to one another. This is what you might call a moral or spiritual truth that can be found to some degree or another in religious and philosophical traditions all over the world, and which has by this point been abundantly confirmed by science. Our bodies, all of our bodies, are part and parcel of the planet. They are all composed of the same elements. We are literally, as religious literature tells us, figuratively molded from the same dust. And from all the developments in paleontology and genetics in recent decades, we know without a shadow of a doubt that we are all incredibly closely related to each other. And this is reflected in this map, which is a map of the dispersal of anatomically modern human beings out of Africa starting some 70,000 years ago. But it's not just our bodies that are closely related to each other. We are also connected at the level of mind. According to an Australian psychologist named Thomas Sudendorf in his 2013 book, The Gap, The Science of What Separates Us from Other Animals, what distinguishes human beings from all other life on our planet is not so much our physical characteristics, but our open-ended ability to imagine and reflect on different situations, and our deep-seated drive to link our scenario-building minds together. In other words, we are one species that has dispersed over the whole surface of the planet, yet we have never lost the fundamental drive to communicate with each other, to reason together, to link our minds together across space and time, to imagine futures together. This fundamental characteristic of human beings, this built-in tendency that we have to link our minds together, gives rise to the second proposition. And that is that the next stage of our evolution is to learn to live and work and find fulfillment together as a single race, as equal citizens of a single global homeland. By this, I mean, if we look back over the long span of human history, I'm not talking about 50 years or 500 years, I'm talking about 10,000 years, 100,000 years, 200,000 years. It's easy to fixate on the many fits and starts, the obvious violence and suffering that we have inflicted on each other over and over again. But we can also discern a different trend. A trend that extends from our biological evolution to our social and cultural evolution. And that is the linking of our minds together across greater and greater distances and in greater and greater degrees of unity and complexity. If we are, in fact, one species inhabiting one planet with the distinguishing feature of constantly seeking connection with each other, then at this point, from this perspective, it's not a particularly radical conclusion that the outcome of this development will have to be some kind of a peaceful global civilization governed by some kind of participatory democratic world federation that would have the responsibility to protect the whole planet and all of its inhabitants. From the perspective of this photo, which was only taken in 1972, this next stage in the evolution of our collective life and consciousness is what the French philosopher and paleontologist Pierre de Chardin memorably described in the mid-20th century as the planetization of mankind. and Teilhard was not alone. Indeed, that first proposition, that of basic human oneness and equality, gained almost universal currency in the second half of the 20th century. You're familiar with this. In large part, it was a reckoning with World War II and the Nazi imperial and racial ideology that resulted in the genocide of Europe's Jewish population. That is a theme that will come up later. And this second proposition about the movement toward some kind of a global civilization and a global polity that would manifest and embody human equality, that was also widely discussed. Previous generations of academics and activists and public figures, including Albert Einstein and Eleanor Roosevelt, discussed and advocated for a constitutional federal world government during World War II and certainly afterwards in the context of the Cold War and decolonization. And here are just a few examples of some of this discourse just from the United States. This is a World War II poster, the United Nations fight for freedom, and the way I arranged it, they seem to be pointing towards peace, reconsidering racism, one world. This was a Republican candidate for president against FDR, who toured the world and came back and said, here is my proposal for how to unify the whole planet, right? But despite major crises today that pretty obviously call for an effective and participatory architecture of global decision-making, and we can make a list: the Russian war against Ukraine and the West, the unfolding crisis in the Middle East, catastrophic climate change, the movement of migrants and refugees, managing the COVID pandemic and whatever disease comes next, regulating multinational companies and capital flows and supply chains, responding to transnational terrorism and organized crime and corruption, the widespread deployment of AI and surveillance technologies, just to name a few. Despite so much evidence that the existential problems we face go far beyond the powers of national governments to solve, serious discussion about how to create and build a real system of global government seems to have become quite unpopular in academic and policy circles today. And unless you look to science fiction depictions of the future, it doesn't really seem to be on the public agenda at all. Now, there are some perfectly understandable reasons why academics these days avoid anything that smacks of a grand narrative. Any notion of a telos, that is a goal or a purpose to history, right? The 20th century is full of examples of movements and regimes that brought incalculable suffering onto humanity in the name of their particular vision of the future. And here are some figures that you recognize: Lenin, Mussolini, Hitler, Stalin, and Mao. As the last of these big movements, global communism, collapsed in 1989, an American political scientist named Frank Fukuyama published an essay entitled "The End of History," in which he argued that with the end of the Soviet Union and the superpower rivalry that had so defined the world since 1945, Western liberal values and capitalism and democracy had triumphed and would become universal. They were the final form of human government. Fukuyama was not advancing an idea of a global polity, but he was saying that the ideological conflict of the past was basically over and that the West had won, and what we could expect from the future was more or less freedom from existential conflict. Now, here we are more than 30 years later, and what we see all around us on on all sides is more like shattering. In the post-September 11, 2001 world, there are so many currents pushing people apart rather than bringing them together. So it shouldn't come as a surprise that during this period, which incidentally is the same period during which I have acquired my graduate education and started to pursue my career. During this period, many social scientists, many historians have tended to pursue narrow specializations, specific topics. They have focused on the safely particular and shied away from bold theories or grand statements which, like Fukuyama's, risk being proven embarrassingly false sooner or later. To bring this closer to home, I want to pull out the preface to Walter Edgar's massive and in many ways truly excellent synthesis, South Carolina History, published in the late 1990s. And I know at least one of you is intimately familiar with this book. So this is the book on South Carolina's history. I've used it as the principal text in my South Carolina history course at FMU since right after I started teaching in 2007. Might be time to freshen that up, we'll see. So Edgar, writing in the 90s, he benefits greatly from the civil rights movement and the turn towards social history. He integrates Black people into the narrative of South Carolina in very important and unprecedented ways. This is literally true from the first page when he quotes two Black South Carolinians, Benjamin Brawley and Kelly Miller, from the 1920s to establish the significance of the topic. He quotes Brawley, "The little triangle on the map known as South Carolina represents a portion of our country whose influence has been incalculable." And then he quotes Miller, "There is not a dull period in South Carolina's history." And Edgar agrees, at least up to a point, at least for the period from the founding of the Carolina colony in 1670 to the end of Reconstruction, almost exactly 200 years later. After that, though, Edgar says that South Carolina slips out of the national consciousness. While some individual South Carolinians may gain some recognition after Reconstruction, he says, especially after the New Deal, after World War II, the state itself slips to the middle at best in terms of economic and political influence in the country. He quotes a character from a Pat Conroy novel, a teenager who balks at having to take South Carolina history. He says, "I've lived all over the world and I've never heard one person mention the state's name. It's nowhere, man." And I think this begins to show us something interesting and important about Edgar's approach to this book. Because as much as it's a work of synthesis, pulling together the best scholarship up to the 1990s, as much as it seeks to understand South Carolina in regional and national and international context, and as much as it attempts to treat Black South Carolinians as an integral part of the state's story, it is still agnostic about the oneness and equality of humanity as a fact. And it is completely silent about any general trend in our collective social and cultural development. And I am suggesting that this is a blind spot that leads to Edgar minimizing South Carolina's importance after Reconstruction, which I think is arguably when the story gets even more compelling. Walk with me. All right, we need to try to unpack this blind spot. Because I think it has a great deal to do with how we orient ourselves, not just to studying South Carolina's history in general, but specifically to our orientation to governance and policy and the health of our democracy right now. So right after he quotes Brawley and Miller and the kid from Beach Music, Edgar discusses how he came to decide upon his thesis. He says that one possibility he considered was the idea of one people, which he discussed on a number of occasions with his distinguished colleague George Rogers, the late historian at the University of South Carolina. Rogers had used this phrase, one people, in a lecture to refer to the political consolidation of the planter class across the state in the decade 1800 to 1810. And Edgar had used the same phrase, one people, with a question mark at the end, as the title of a workshop for teachers about cultural memory in South Carolina. They discussed this as a possible thesis for his book, but Edgar says that he rejected that idea because, as he put it, although South Carolinians may in reality be one people, at least culturally, in the 1990s, not all the state's citizens consider that to be the case. Then he quite rightly makes this list of all the various categories of people who at one time or another over the centuries are excluded from power or marginalized in South Carolina. And he concludes, quote, "I do not believe that there has ever been any intention to create a polity of one people in South Carolina," unquote. In other words, what he's saying is that some portion of South Carolina's people at the time of writing do not believe in human equality. They don't believe that they are fundamentally the same as or share a basic identity with the other human beings who live in South Carolina. And he says some portion of South Carolinians have never believed in human equality. And so therefore, the ideal or the goal of one people in South Carolina cannot be how we organize our thinking about ourselves. Instead, he chooses as the organizing principle for his narrative a different phrase: the good order and the harmony of the whole community. Significantly and ironically, but I don't think Edgar means to be ironic at all, this phrase is actually a quote from a piece of legislation that created the South Carolina College, the future USC, in the new state capital of Columbia in 1801. This is the creation of South Carolina College is actually a move which was a major part of that consolidation of the slaveholding class around the state in the first decade of the 19th century that I just mentioned. But for some reason, Edgar does not explain at all where this key phrase is from or what brought it to his attention. What he does do, much as he did with the idea of one people, is point out that even these milder terms of good order and harmony of the whole community have often been interpreted quite differently by those who were in charge of South Carolina and those who had to live under the supposed good order that they were creating. He says, not all the instances of ensuring good order were benign. On more than one occasion, harmony has been a misnomer, nor has the whole community included all the people living in South Carolina. But if this is the case, then why choose this phrase as the book's organizing principle? Because he says, at whatever stage you look in South Carolina's history, whoever was in charge of ruling endeavored to promote what they envisioned as the good order and the harmony of the whole community. All right, let's pause for a moment. Let's discuss what he's done. Not only has he set aside the idea of South Carolina as one people. But in fact, what he says is that we should organize our thinking about the state's history first and foremost as the ideas and agendas of those who were in charge of governing. The implication is that the ideas and the agendas of the rest of the people, those who were excluded from power or marginalized, are therefore not the lens with which we should view the past. Those ideas and agendas will not be the organizing principle of the text, even apparently as a dialectic or in kind of a creative tension with the ideas of the elites. In this way of seeing things, power and influence flows only from top to bottom, from the center to the people on the edges. In South Carolina's case, of course, that means generally, among other things, power flows from male to female, from white to black and indigenous, from Christian and Protestant and Baptist and Methodist to non-Christian, non-Protestant, non-Baptist and Methodist, from English-speaking to speakers of other languages, from the free to the enslaved, from the wealthy to the poor, and after the Civil War, certainly increasingly from north to south as South Carolina becomes a backwater. But do we really believe that power and influence and ideas only flow in one direction? Do we really think that the marginalized are powerless? I think that most historians and social scientists would agree with me that this is not an accurate or effective way to think about human societies in the past. And it is certainly no way to think about the important policy choices that South Carolinians face at this moment. Now, I want to return for a moment and get clear on some things about this idea that Edgar rejected as his thesis. Okay? Edgar says point blank that he doesn't think that there has ever been any intention to create a polity of one people in South Carolina. That is a categorical statement. I do not think that there has ever been any intention to create a polity of one people in South Carolina. The problem is that that is not true. Before the Civil War, the enslaved envisioned a polity of one people in South Carolina. That is precisely why so many of them put on the uniform of the United States as soon as they got the chance to help put down the slaveholders' rebellion in the Civil War and to fight for universal human rights. And it was on this very same basis that black voters and office holders and their white allies set out to make South Carolina into a new polity during Reconstruction. And even after Reconstruction's demise, a number of movements continued to work and advocate for a polity of one people in South Carolina. The Populists in the 1890s, the NAACP starting in Charleston and Columbia in 1917, the labor organizers during the New Deal, some of them inspired by communism, the civil rights movement of the mid-20th century, and the community that I've studied the most, the Baha'i faith. The point is, since before the Civil War, through Reconstruction, and at every moment since then, black South Carolinians and some portion of perceptive whites have held on to the ideals of human equality and human dignity, of democracy and justice, and have been working explicitly and remarkably consistently to make real a polity of one people in South Carolina. This is an entirely different way of viewing South Carolina's past, And I think it sheds an indispensable light on the questions that press on us today. Yet, what Edgar tells us is that after Reconstruction, and particularly after the New Deal in World War II, in other words, the most important phases of the civil rights movement and of white reactions against the civil rights movement, this is when South Carolina fades from the national consciousness. Its history may still be interesting in and of itself, it's just not particularly relevant to the national story. But doesn't that just sound like the 1990s talking? Doesn't Edgar sound a lot like Francis Fukuyama at the end of the Cold War? When all the struggles of the past are supposedly put to rest and capitalism and democracy are now just going to be free to unfold unopposed? Surely in that future that Fukuyama in 1989 and Edgar in 1997 see, these unfortunate things from the past like racial hierarchy and religious prejudice and economic injustice, they'll just naturally fade away. In this future that they see, just a few tweaks here and there, and South Carolina won't be the buckle of the stroke belt and such a leader in child poverty. In that future, nothing that people are doing would cause temperatures to rise and the seas to swell and the rivers to burst their banks, bringing 1,000-year floods to South Carolina 3 times in 4 years, sweeping us away, starting with the poorest and the most vulnerable. In that future, if we do still have outbursts of violence against black people or other marginalized people, surely those are just isolated incidents, right? Because the general trend is peace and prosperity. In this future that they're telling us about, there's no way that an old Vietnam vet in Florence would ambush law enforcement officers coming to his house to serve a warrant on his adult son accused of sexually abusing a foster child. There is no way that that white man would need a private arsenal of 129 guns in his house. And surely, in Fukuyama's future, in Edgar's future, none of that would have anything to do with this. But then, well, how did this happen? How did this banner get inside the US Capitol in 2021? If the future is just supposed to be more of the same, generic progress and prosperity, if South Carolina and all the unpleasant past that it represents don't matter anymore in the national consciousness, then how did this banner, the symbol of a political movement that aimed to create a new country based explicitly on human inequality, a movement led by rich white South Carolinians, and which went down to overwhelming military defeat in 1865, how did this banner end up carried through the US Capitol on January 6, 2021? How did this banner, finally removed from the grounds of the South Carolina State House in 2015, in the wake of the Charleston Massacre, lead the way in a multifaceted, violent coup attempt that extended across multiple states and Washington, D.C.? We have to answer these questions. In order to do so, I would like to draw on the invaluable work of one of our best historians and public intellectuals in the U.S. today, Professor Timothy Snyder of Yale University. In particular, this 2018 book that he wrote called The Road to Unfreedom, Russia, Europe, America, about what happened in the world and in the United States in the 2010s. So in this book, he introduces two contrasting approaches to time and to memory, which help us to explain the situation in which we find ourselves right now and help point to the responsibilities that we face. He calls these two ways of thinking the politics of inevitability and the politics of eternity. And to explain these, I hope you'll indulge me while I read a bit. It's less than 2 pages from the preface, starting right where Snyder refers directly to Fukuyama. And actually, I need to stop here for a second because my phone is over there, and this does not provide a timepiece while the slide shows up. So I just want to put somebody's phone right in front of me just so I can tell what time it is. If you don't mind. Is that right? Thank you. Very kind. All these details. Here's Snyder. Americans and Europeans were guided through the new century by a tale about the end of history, by what I will call the politics of inevitability. A sense that the future is just more of the present, that the laws of progress are known, that there are no alternatives, and therefore nothing really to be done. In the American capitalist version of the story, nature brought the market, which brought democracy, which brought happiness. In the European version, history brought the nation, which learned from war that peace was good, and hence chose integration and prosperity. Before the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, communism had its own politics of inevitability. Nature permits technology. Technology brings social change. Social change causes revolution. Revolution enacts utopia. When this turned out not to be true, the European and American politicians of inevitability were triumphant. Europeans busied themselves completing the creation of the European Union in 1992. Americans reasoned that the failure of the communist story confirmed the truth of the capitalist one. Americans and Europeans kept telling themselves their tales of inevitability for a quarter century after the end of communism, and so raised a millennial generation without history. The American politics of inevitability, like all such stories, resisted facts. The fates of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus after 1991 showed well enough that the fall of one system did not create a blank slate on which nature generated markets and markets generated rights. Iraq in 2003 might have confirmed this lesson had the initiators of America's illegal war reflected upon its disastrous consequences. The financial crisis of 2008 and the deregulation of campaign contributions in the United States in 2010 magnified the influence of the wealthy and reduced that of voters. As economic inequality grew, time horizons shrank, and fewer Americans believed that the future held a better version of the present. Lacking a functional state that assured basic social goods taken for granted elsewhere, education, pensions, health care, transport, parental leave, vacations, Americans could be overwhelmed by each day and lose a sense of the future. The collapse of the politics of inevitability ushers in another experience of time, the politics of eternity. Whereas inevitability promises a better future for everyone, eternity places one nation at the center of a cyclical story of victimhood. Time is no longer a line into the future, but a circle that endlessly returns the same threats from the past. Within inevitability, no one is responsible because we all know that the details will sort themselves out for the better. Within eternity, no one is responsible because we all know that the enemy is coming no matter what we do. Eternity politicians spread the conviction that government cannot aid society as a whole, but can only guard against threats. Progress gives way to doom. We're getting very close to the moment in which we live, so all of this should sound very familiar from your own experience. In power, eternity politicians manufacture crisis and manipulate the resultant emotion. To distract from their inability or unwillingness to reform, eternity politicians instruct their citizens to experience elation and outrage at short intervals, drowning the future in the present. In foreign policy, eternity politicians belittle and undo the achievements of countries that might seem like models to their own citizens. Using technology to transmit political fiction, both at home and abroad, eternity politicians deny truth and seek to reduce life to spectacle and feeling. Snyder's a good writer and a deep thinker and an incisive critic of the very recent past. So what he does next in this preface to his book is to lay out a case for how in the 2010s, the history of Russia and Ukraine and the European Union and the United States are all in fact one interrelated story of the collapse of the politics of inevitability, that Fukuyama Edgar version, and the rise of the politics of eternity, beginning, this is going to be very familiar, beginning with Putin's regime in Russia and culminating in the election of Russia's candidate for president of the United States, Donald Trump, in 2016. And Snyder makes the argument that if we are to understand the time in which we live and to respond appropriately, then we have to use real historical thinking that is neither inevitability nor eternity. A historical thinking based on human agency, the ability of individuals and groups to act, to make decisions based in reality, to determine their own future. This is a kind of historical thinking that is intimately connected to a consideration of values. What is right and wrong in public life? Snyder says, history is and must be political thought, in the sense that it opens an aperture between inevitability and eternity, preventing us from drifting from the one to the other, helping us see the moment when we might make a difference. So, the social conditions in which we find ourselves clearly cry out for new visions of identity and common purpose, new visions of the proper relation between individuals and the government, of what constitutes a good and a prosperous and a cohesive society. In other words, what kind of future we want and what we have to do to build it. And Snyder is arguing, and he's not the only one, but I think he's particularly cogent and apt in his argument. Snyder is arguing that history is essential to the task of building the future. And in this sense, the good news that I have to share is that we're in a very different place in terms of the historical scholarship that we have to work with now compared to the 1990s about South Carolina and more broadly. And perhaps the biggest challenge we have today is not like coming up with new scholarship and new understandings, but it's really engaging and empowering as many people as possible, not just professors and university students, but more importantly, teachers and K through 12 students and their parents and their grandparents with the best historical thinking and historical scholarship that we have to offer. To return specifically to South Carolina, I count myself among a number of historians and other social scientists, and particularly a growing ecosystem that we have of public historians who have concluded that perhaps the most important part of this new and more comprehensive and more useful view of our past, this understanding of history that liberates us to construct a future rather than just be swept away by it. Perhaps the most critical part is reassessing the roles of Black people in creating and sustaining South Carolina and the United States, and indeed the entire modern world. I want to show you a couple of relatively recent examples from public history about what I'm talking about this necessary reassessment. I'm going to play for you a 3.5 minute clip. It's the introductory scenes to a 4-hour documentary called Reconstruction, America After the Civil War, which first came out on PBS in April 2019. It was executive produced by Professor Henry Louis Gates, who's a literary scholar and the director of the Hutchins Center for African and African American Research at Harvard. The clip starts with a deceptively beautiful image that very quickly turns disturbing. It turns into scenes of the Charleston Massacre of 2015. And then it briefly sets out the argument about what Reconstruction was, why it was destroyed, and why it was replaced with Jim Crow, and why Americans today need to look at Reconstruction with fresh eyes, right? Let's look, and as you watch it, remember that what we're looking for here, what you're paying attention for, is how we think about Black people and about South Carolina in the context of the country's history. And again, just word to the wise, there are images of violence throughout the clip.
On the evening of June 17, 2015, a stranger walked into an historic Black church in Charleston, South Carolina, known as Mother and Mary. He prayed with the Wednesday night Bible study group for almost an hour. Then, he opened fire.
We have 9 victims, and I do believe this was a hate crime.
Friends say the 21-year-old high school dropout was a loner, an unabashed racist with a deep hatred for Black people.
He just said, I have to do it. He said, you rape our women and you take it over our country.
The massacre in Charleston touched off not only a debate over the Confederate flag, but it touched off a debate all over the country. How did we get here? And why is this happening?
It was easy, I guess, to think of that as a singular horror. And it was convenient, I think, to think of it that way. Unless you really wanted to understand how this could happen. And then that meant that you had to get into the history.
Most of us know that our country fought a civil war in the 1860s. But less is known about what came afterward. the chaotic, exhilarating, and ultimately devastating period known as Reconstruction. If we're looking for the roots of the tragedy at Mother Emanuel, this is where we have to start.
The Reconstruction period is one of extraordinary excitement, the time when America could finally become that land of freedom that it had promised to be since the very beginning.
Black people actually sat in the House of Representatives and the Senate. Poor whites and black people saw a common cause with one another.
You're seeing this opportunity and imagining that will only get better. And looking back, what we know is those black folks had no idea of the cliff that they were heading towards.
The achievements of Reconstruction triggered a fearsome backlash, an onslaught of terror and depression that lasted for decades.
After 250 years of slavery, white Southerners could not quite accept the 4 million former slaves as equal members of their society.
Violence is used in conjunction with Jim Crow in order to strip African Americans of the rights and privileges they gained during Reconstruction. The Charleston Massacre comes from a long history of white terror against African Americans.
But Reconstruction left a legacy of hope, as well as violence.
We have to recognize the injustices that were inflicted, but we can't reduce all history to that injustice. People who have been held in perpetual bondage confronted the greatest sin of American history straight on.
Their hopes were far greater than maybe what any government can accomplish. A system functioning without race being a barrier to equality, we still haven't quite gotten there.
Almost a century and a half later, we still find ourselves haunted by the collapse of Reconstruction, a chapter of our history that's often been misrepresented and misunderstood. It's time that we acknowledge the true story and complete the work of reconstructing America.
All right, so that's the opening sequence. Let's just recap and make sure we get the high points here. So this is packed. This is a national story that begins in the present day in Charleston with the murder of black people in this historic house of worship, motivated by right-wing, anti-black rhetoric about the defense of white women and the fear of black people taking over the country, demographically and politically. Then one scholar says that this event sparked a national debate, not just about the Confederate flag flying at the South Carolina State House, but more broadly for the whole country. How did we get here and why is this happening? And then another scholar says that for some, it was easy and convenient to think of the Charleston Massacre as a singular horror, but if you really want to get at why this happened, you have to get into the history. So very quickly, what we have in this really short sequence is a case that the filmmakers are making, that in order to understand contemporary events, we have to have a clear understanding of our past and particularly of Reconstruction and its aftermath, okay? Then they set out to explain Reconstruction, present Reconstruction as this moment. Yeah.
I just had another thought as we were watching it. It just made me think about when I was watching it, black folks and the white folks together.
Yeah.
In the community and economic just like system going on and that was like that's really what it was about, the freedom of being able to achieve something in this country without equality being a question of it.
I mean that's exactly the point. That's exactly how we identify this as this kind of like a golden moment of opportunity.
Yeah.
that because of how successful it was, they mentioned, right? Because of how much distance was covered so quickly, it was not perfect at all. But in context, so much happened so quickly, and the backlash was fierce and violent, right? So Reconstruction was undone. It's replaced with these regimes of white supremacy and all this anti-black violence that goes with it. But did you notice too that they point out this other stream, that the dream of Reconstruction never really dies. It goes through black and biracial organizing in the NAACP. You end up with, you come right back to the present and you've got a shot of Black Lives Matter, right? Which is, of course, in response to police violence all over the country in the 2010s. And then you end with Gates saying, it's time to acknowledge the true story and complete the work of reconstructing America. So that moment of Reconstruction is still held up as the standard, if you will. So the long and short of it is that reassessing Reconstruction is a key or the key to securing the country's future. This seems to be what the filmmakers are saying. And because of the way they set this up by starting it in Charleston, and because we know that South Carolina's experience of Reconstruction was in many ways the most successful, the longest of any of the former Confederate states, the pretty clear implication here is that if the country as a whole, and particularly if white America, wants to understand itself, then it has to understand black people, and it has to understand South Carolina then and now. All right, that's my first example. I want to give you another example, and maybe you're more familiar with this one. It is even better known, even if you weren't aware of Gates' documentary. If you didn't hear about this one, then at least you are familiar with the fallout from it, which is ongoing. This, and I guarantee that one of you knows this from Intro to African and African American Studies last semester. It came out just a few months after Gates' documentary in August 2019 in the New York Times Magazine to mark the 400th anniversary of, anybody? That's right, the 400th anniversary of the arrival of some 20 to 30 enslaved Africans in the English colony of Virginia. It was called the 1619 Project. Does that ring a bell for anybody? It commemorates this at least symbolic beginning of the system of slavery in what would become the United States. So there's this special issue of the New York Times Magazine that the editors say on the first page is about reframing American history. Reframing American history by considering what it would mean to regard 1619 as our nation's birth year instead of 1776. In other words, they're asking us to engage in a thought experiment. How might our collective understanding of ourselves change if we simply change the year in which we start, the event we mark as the beginning? They stated that to do so requires us to place the consequences of slavery and the contributions of black Americans at the very center of the story we tell ourselves about who we are as a country. Now, they are not confused. They know that 1776 is when the Declaration of Independence was signed. But they're asking us on purpose to switch up the beginning to see how that changes the way we think. What follows in the body of the special issue is a provocative introductory essay by the project lead, Nicole Hannah-Jones, and 9 additional essays by academics and journalists on a variety of topics, and a photo essay, a collection of poems and fiction by another 16 authors. It's a real tour de force. They were honored with a Pulitzer Prize in 2020 for this work. And interestingly, the Pulitzer Prize Committee stated that the project had prompted public conversation about the nation's founding and evolution. And Lord have mercy, was that an understatement. What happened was a firestorm of controversy when this thing was published. And it emanated from what Timothy Snyder might call the practitioners of the politics of eternity in a number of states and in the Trump administration and among their allies in the mass media. To get at what the problem was, I want to just share a little bit from Nicole Hannah-Jones's essay at the beginning. This is not going to come as a surprise to y'all. So the first thing she explains is that the nation's wealth came principally from the stolen labor of African slaves, right? This, of course, is entirely in line with all of the historical scholarship, but it's controversial for some people, of course, who still prefer to think of slavery and racism as an aberration, in the words of a Texas law that was passed right after this was published, an aberration, a deviation from America's main story of automatically expanding freedom and prosperity. So Hannah Jones starts there, but then she goes even further. She says the lightning bolt was her assertion that it is black people who have been primarily responsible for making the United States into something like a democracy. Here's how she says it. She says, it would be historically inaccurate to reduce the contributions of black people to the vast material wealth created by our bondage. Black Americans have also been, and continue to be, foundational to the idea of American freedom. More than any other group in this country's history, we have served generation after generation in an overlooked but vital role. It is we who have been the perfecters of this democracy. The United States is a nation, she says, founded on both an ideal and a lie. Our Declaration of Independence, signed on July 4, 1776, proclaims that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. But the white men who drafted those words did not believe them to be true for the hundreds of thousands of black people in their midst. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness did not apply to fully 1/5 of the country. Yet despite being violently denied the freedom and justice promised to all, black Americans believed fervently in the American creed. Through centuries of black resistance and protest, we have helped the country to live up to its founding ideals. And not only for ourselves, black rights struggles paved the way for every other rights struggle, including women's and gay rights, immigrant and disability rights. Without the idealistic, strenuous, and patriotic efforts of black Americans, our democracy today would most likely look very different. It might not be a democracy at all. Now, I want to remind you about the chronology here, because it's very important for getting us down to the minute. Snyder's book is published in 2018. The Gates documentary and the 1619 Project come out a few months apart in 2019. This is after the Black Lives Matter movement. This is after the Charleston Massacre. This is after the election of 2016, after the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, Virginia. You remember about the neo-Nazis and the white supremacists and the Klan got together to protest taking down the big statue of General Lee and killed a white counter-protester in the process. And the president at the time condoned the violence. But it was before the country had really started to come to terms with the extent to which the Russian government had interfered in the 2016 election. In large part by stoking racial animosities on social media in swing states with important black electorates. In fact, the Mueller report was released in the same month as the Gates documentary. This was before the first impeachment, when we started to see the extent to which corruption and authoritarianism within our own government had served the interests of the Russian dictator in attempting to derail the transition to democracy in Ukraine. In fact, Lieutenant Colonel Vindman made his whistleblower complaint the same month that the 1619 Project was released. This was before the pandemic started, before the unprecedented demonstrations in the summer of 2020 after the murders of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd. and the threats by the president to call out the military to put them down. It was before the election of 2020 and the attempts to overthrow the election, before the attack of January 6, 2021, that resulted in that unforgettable image of the Confederate flag flying inside the U.S. Capitol. In other words, Henry Louis Gates and Nicole Hannah-Jones were right on the money about the centrality of slavery and Reconstruction and black organizing and the history of black visions of the future of this country and what it must become, and particularly in South Carolina, to the history of the nation and its long and twisted path toward justice and equality and democracy. And in the few years since then, events have only underscored their point, and the point that Tim Snyder was making. It is clearer than ever that understanding this history correctly is a key to the health and even the survival of our democracy. And because of our country's outsized influence in the world and the way our domestic affairs affect global policy and vice versa, and here I'm thinking back to that long list of crises that I gave you earlier, you can certainly make the argument that the whole world really needs for Americans, and for that matter South Carolinians, to get our history and our policy right. So this draws to a close the time that we have right now. What I want to do when we get back together is share with you two new books that have really helped reshape my thinking about many of these matters. And I want to present to you very, very briefly kind of a different chronology than what I'm used to, and I think than what you are used to, of South Carolina's history, using these two books sort of as two lights. So it's like you're not presenting completely new information, but because you're taking two lights from two different sources, maybe you're seeing some things that were a little bit in the shadows more clearly, right? So that's what I want to do next time. I wonder, in just the few minutes that we have, if you have any questions or any comments about, I know I threw a lot out at you.
It seems to be really the basis for like this country building, stuff that was going on. What was it? What were you talking about? That dream, that Reconstruction dream, seemed like that's a really during that time that would have been a really golden dream to just keep going after and expanding upon. Former slaves now becoming part of the society. When it all comes together, it just all builds up. And like, I know a bunch of people could have saw it. How much business, how much money, everything that was just going to be involved in it. And at the same time, I would think, what would the U.S. look like if that dream, that golden dream, had not just been a dream, but had become goals for an entire society to live by?
Yeah.
We would live in an entirely different world. A lot of the stuff I would deal with, I probably wouldn't even deal with right now.
Yeah.
And it's like that was truly a golden dream for this country right there. And I think if we get back to really what that dream was about, we might move this country in a different direction. Because that really made me think about really what the substance of America is about. And that dream right there really made me think about it.
Yeah, thank you for that. We don't want to romanticize Reconstruction, because it was very, very hard work for those who participated. But at the same time, we can't minimize what they did, the accomplishments that they did make, and that they set a new kind of benchmark, a new kind of expectation that, okay, even if there was reversal, right? Even if it took many, many decades to get back to like the legislation of the civil rights movement in the 1960s, maybe, even though it takes 100 years to get back to something like that, but they set the standard for thinking about what is possible, right? But we also don't want to fall into anything like that politics of eternity, where like we don't want to be looking backwards to what the country can be, right? Of course, we look at examples and what are the visions, what are the dreams that have fired people's imaginations in the past. But but always, you know, the vision has to be forward, right? So looking back in order to figure out what to do next. But I think I agree with Gates and with Nicole Hannah-Jones and with this whole host of scholars that this kind of reassessment we're not just kind of trying to resurrect the past. What we're trying to do is find usable frames of reference so that we can make better decisions right now, so that we can think better about where we're headed, right? That's that liberatory piece that I think we can access when we get a hold of Reconstruction.
You really start thinking about it, I'm like, not everything, but a few seeds, just a few pickets. I think it wouldn't look too bad in this time, but not everything, because that was still then. What we know now, and then using a couple of seeds from back then, it might, you know, for what's in the future, might set us up better. But that's enough. We gotta get up on out.
Yeah, no, I appreciate it. All right, y'all, this is great. We will do some more when we get back together.